Jerusalem appealed to Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, and Jephaiah, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon. Come up and help me attack Gibeon, because it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites. Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron and Jarmuth, Lachish and Eglon, joined forces. They moved up with all their troops and took up their positions against Gibeon and attacked it. The Gibeonites then sent word to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal, "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us." So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army, including all the best fighting men. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel, so Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Horon and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Melchidah. And they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah. The Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ai Halon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down until a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. Then Joshua returned with all Israel to the camp at Gilgal. I'm sure you're pleased I didn't ask you to read that chapter with all those awful names that we're not so used to. And we don't really know how correctly to pronounce them, because obviously biblical Hebrew is a dead language. It's not spoken today. So we just don't know how they pronounce those names in their own days. When lecturing to students at the Bible College and trying to teach them how to preach, when it came to their time to preach and the thing was videoed and then it was critiqued by myself and for their fellow students as well, I used to generally tell them this little story. And it's an incident in the life of Dr. Donald Gray Barnhouse, who was for many years pastor of the very well-known 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. But way before that, about 12 years after Barnhouse had graduated from the Princeton Theological Seminary in the States, Dr. Barnhouse was invited back to preach in the chapel at the Theological Seminary. That was a great honor, and his former professor of Old Testament, who had taught him the Old Testament, a man called Robert Dick Wilson, sat attentively in the front row to listen to this ex-student to see how he did. Well, after Barnhouse had preached his sermon, Wilson approached him and said, "If you come back to Princeton again, I will not come to hear you preach. I only come once. I am glad you are a big God-er." When the students come back to the seminary, I only come to hear them once, just to ascertain whether they are a big God-er. and then I know what kind of ministry they will have. Now, Barnhouse was a bit confused, as you look a bit confused as well this morning, and asked him to explain what on earth did he mean. And Wilson said, some people have a little God, and people who have a little God always seem to have trouble with a little God and with what he's doing or what he's not doing. He can't do any miracles. He can't take care of the inspiration of scriptures and the inspiration of them and the preservation of them. Obviously, there's just not the miracle in that the scriptures were originally inspired. There is the preservation of those scriptures down through the centuries so that we have them there in our Bibles in front of us today in a reliable format. Now, God, by his grace, has been over the preservation of his word. So what we read today, we believe is the word of God. But he said there are some people that gives them huge problems, and they have a little God, and this man Wilson liked to call them little godders. And there are those who have a great God who believe that when he speaks, it's done, and when he commands, it stands still, and when they give strength to his people, they can rely upon that and they can trust his promises. And then he said to Barnhouse, you have a great God, he will bless your ministry, and you are a big Godder. So let me ask you this morning, how big is your God? Is he big enough to create the universe and uphold it by the word of his power? And is he great enough to providentially govern its direction unto the end that he has precisely planned for the end of this world? Do you believe that he has the power to do that? Or do you worship and serve and love some tiny God, a sort of pygmy God? Thinking of St. Patrick's Day yesterday, a wee little God, you know, that you put in a little box. A so-called God who is unsure of himself. And therefore, to say that he's a sovereign God, it makes some people have a choke. Because the theists often feel that today that God remains in heaven, but he is unsure about what his purposes and plans are. And you can't guarantee that he has the desire or the ability to accomplish what he has said he might do. Well, I can say with certainty that Joshua was a big Godder. Now, you know, if you know the book of Joshua, that those 3 chapters that we have missed out record 2 major hashes, failures, mess-ups by Joshua as a leader. And it's good just to remind ourselves that good leaders, spirit-anointed leaders, fail at times. And Joshua did that over the capturing of Ai, and he just blew it, and he really did mess up big time. He grew overconfident and forgot to consult God before attacking Ai. And the name Ai means heap of ruins. Where do you live? I live in heap of ruins. Wow. But it was clearly a less fortified, by that name, a less fortified city than Jericho was. And there is no mention in the text whatsoever that Joshua sought guidance from God. Now, or anything from the priest. Remember, he was acting as high priest as well. So he had the Urim and the Thummim, the dices that were kept in the pouch of the high priest, the yes and the no, which they could go to find out what God's will was. He no longer sought God for guidance of that. And in fact, Joshua then sends up only 3,000 men to fight against the city of Ai, which had a population of around 12,000. And it seems that Joshua had forgotten that the fall of Jericho was not due to the prowess of his army. You know, the most disastrous time for a leader is often a period of great success. And that goes for us as individual Christians as well. If we feel we've been successful in doing something for God, then, you know, we have to watch it very carefully. And watch very carefully when the adrenaline starts to drop. You know, and the adrenaline is very important for preachers. Very adrenaline pumps around, does the will of God for you. You know, how on earth did Jesus in the Gospels ever turn the tables and the chairs of the money changers over? Where did he get the anger from to do that? And it wasn't anger. You know, he said, zeal for God's house, anger for God's house has consumed me at this point. Well, it was the adrenaline, wasn't it? And the adrenaline moved him not to sin, but to do the will of God. And so we have to watch it very carefully when we feel we've been successful. And that was the case with Joshua. You see, faith and presumption are two very, very different things. And presumption, if we go down that route, always ends up with us getting stuck, as Joshua found out. And it ends in abject failure, as it did for Joshua as well. And Joshua shows us what to do with his failures. And what we do with our failures, as Joshua says, is in chapter 7 and verses 6 to 10, he brings them into the presence of God. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their head. And Joshua said, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servants, Lord." And Joshua and his fellow leaders are honest that this defeat at Ai spelt disaster for them. You see, the Canaanites, up to this point, we read, their hearts had melted for fear because they had heard what Joshua and the people had done to the town of Jericho and its walls. Now, because little Ai defeats the people of God, the rest of the Canaanites living in the land are energized. Oh, if they can do it, we can do it. We don't have to give way to fear anymore. So the enemy had suddenly got twice as large. You know, there is a time for us being on our knees, but there is also a time for jumping up to our feet and doing something. And that's what God says to Joshua here. And if you know the story of Achan's sin, Joshua's mistake there caused the death of 36 soldiers. And it shattered the idea that the Canaanites were unable to stand against Israel. And Joshua, when he prayed there, had to wait a whole day before the Lord answered him. He had to spend a whole day waiting before God answered him. So I think we learn there that prayer without action is as much presumption as action without prayer is as well. And after they had conquered Ai, Joshua then, I think with a renewed commitment to be obedient and to listen to God, wastes no time in leading the Israelites on a brief and brisk march north so that they could rededicate themselves to God. And Joshua had learnt the difference between presumption and faith. And you and I need to be wise to know that there are no shortcuts to God's blessing. And there are no shortcuts to victory. And Joshua now seems to be meticulous in his desire to obey the commands of God. Having messed up and blown it, Wow, he goes with great diligence back to the drawing board and says, God, what do you want me to do here? I'll do everything. We'll consecrate ourselves again to you. So that's Joshua's first failure. And then the second failure that Joshua got involved in was that he entered into a peace treaty with the Gibeonites. And Joshua confesses that this was another major error on his part. It wasn't that he had no way of discerning the Lord's response to these visitors, these Gibeonites, if you know the story, who had come to visit him, because he was the high priest. He had access to the mind and the will and the voice of God. But the Gibeonites tricked Joshua and the other leaders of God's people into signing a peace treaty with them in which Joshua promised to protect them if they were ever attacked. He would come to their rescue. Now, what happened was, when the surrounding Canaanite kings heard of this peace treaty and alliance that the Israelites had made with the Gibeonites, they interpreted that as being a very dangerous and threatening alliance to their safety. And these other kings decided that that had to be broken up, that alliance. And so their solution was to unite their combined military forces and launch an attack on the city of Gibeon. And that's what we read about happening in Joshua 10, verses 1 to 5. And the men of Gibeon responded, as you would expect, having just 3 days earlier signed the treaty, by turning to Joshua for help. And in verse 6, the Gibeonites sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, "Do not abandon your servants. You've just signed the treaty. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us." Now, the people of God are usually happy to follow leaders who have a track record of listening to God. We're happy there. We're happy being in churches where we feel that the leaders of those churches are men and women who listen to the voice of God and hear God and will follow them. You can imagine what was the reaction of Joshua's army when they discovered just within 3 days later that Joshua hadn't stopped to listen and seek God's guidance with regard to a relationship and a treaty with the Gibeonites. They were furious because they expected better of their leader Joshua. And they wanted to tear the treaty up that Joshua had signed. Now, the men of Gibeon were Hivites. Now, you're getting a lot of information this morning. But the Hivites were one of the 7 nations living in Canaan. And their city was just 5 miles southwest of Ai. Now, I think it would have been very easy and very understandable for Joshua to ignore the Gibeonites' cry and plead for help. And I expect that Joshua was tempted, hey, I don't want to listen to their help. After all, the Gibeonites had made a fool of Joshua. They had deceived him. You can read the chapter and find out how they did deceive him. And they had deceived all the leaders of Israel. And they had embarrassed Joshua in front of all his people. That's the last place leaders want to get embarrassed, is in front of the people that they lead. And so Joshua's credibility as a leader had suffered damage at this point. But you see, Joshua had given his word. He had made an oath to the Gibeonites in 9:15. And he felt, obviously, under a moral obligation to them because of that oath. and they were now servants of Israel. And he felt it was morally right that he now had to give them protection when they were threatened. I think in Joshua's reaction here, which is absolutely right, an illustration of a principle that we find in Psalm 15. And in Psalm 15, the person of integrity, according to verse 4 of that psalm, is a person who keeps an oath that they've made even when it hurts. Yes. A person of integrity keeps the oath even though to do so causes them hurt. In other words, they will honor what they have said even though it means difficulty and problems and an uncomfortable life for them. For the person of integrity, their integrity has no price tag. It cannot be bought. And they are willing to make material and physical sacrifices in order to be honest. Now, integrity is vital for leaders, as it is for us as individuals. And we all have degrees and measures of leadership, people that we influence. A leader is just simply somebody who influences other people. And if you know anybody who is influenced by you, then you're a leader, as far as that's concerned. And so we need to be people of integrity. Often over the years, I've thought, thinking about integrity, if there is no risk, and if there is no loss or no painful consequences, will I ever know whether I have integrity? Will we never know what is the motives behind what we do and what we don't do? Is it just a matter of moral conviction, or is it maybe a matter of moral convenience? Because there is a difference between moral conviction and moral convenience. And I think it's when we are forced to suffer loss, maybe for a mistake that we've made, or some ground in front of other people, because we are determined to keep our word and be a person of integrity. It's then, when it's painful, can we know whether I'm just behaving out of moral convenience or out of moral conviction. But back to the narrative again in chapter 10. We're told now that Joshua and his armies made an arduous uphill journey of some 25 miles. It was 3,500 feet of a climb. Can you imagine how the army felt about that? We're not so keen on Joshua now. 25 miles, 3,500 feet climb. And according to verse 8, God promises Joshua that victory is coming. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you." How encouraging that must have been to Joshua, who must have been still reeling from the fallout of the two mistakes that he had made. You know, his failure to deal with Achan's sin before he sent his troops into battle against Ai, and then giving the Canaanites an emboldened sense of courage that they could beat the people of God. So no wonder the army was disgruntled to go and defend and fight for a city that just a few days before had deceived you. You wouldn't want to do that, would you? Now, by the way, these 5 cities that are mentioned here are all cities south of Jericho. Now, the people living in Jerusalem, because that's one of the cities mentioned here, remember this is pre-King David, so David hadn't made the city his capital city at this particular point. The people who were living in Jerusalem at that time were called Jebusites. And the Bible refers to any of the 7 nations that inhabited the promised land any of those 7 nations together as Canaanites, or this other word, Ammonites. And the Canaanites and the Ammonites, according to their use in the Bible, are exactly the same people. And that's the sort of generic name for these 7 nations which Joshua was commanded to obliterate. And the Gibeonites, as I've said, were Hivites. Now, the Gibeonites are often referred to as Ammonites as well. But you know now why that is the case. Now, Joshua's reaction to God's encouragement, we read in verse 9. After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise, and the Lord threw them into confusion before Israel. Now, do you see here that God's reassurance of victory to Joshua does not stifle, but rather stimulates human ingenuity and strategy and activity? God had given a promise to Joshua that he would act and they would be victorious. So does Joshua say, well, I'll just sit down now. We can all camp here for the rest of the night for a day or two and let's just see God defeat them? No. In fact, that God had revealed his sovereign will of what he was going to do. Then Joshua is stirred into action and to strategy and to ingenuity. And God's promises do not allow him to sit down and be passive, but he is energized to pursue more vigorously with every ounce of his strength all that God has promised. Now, God's sovereignty should never undermine our efforts, or our belief in God's sovereignty should never undermine our efforts for him. Rather, a belief in God's sovereignty should energize us with a renewed confidence to do and to work for what God has said he will do and enable us to complete on his behalf. Now, I sometimes smile. If I've mentioned God's sovereignty often in a message, there's normally somebody who comes up and says to me afterwards, John, are you a Calvinist? Now, some of you may not know who a Calvinist is, so don't particularly worry too much about that. But obviously it's somebody who follows basically some of the teachings of Calvin. But are you a Calvinist? And my normal reply to that is, well, what do you understand a Calvinist is? Because I don't want to be labelled with something that I don't believe. Well, and they said, well, I'm not really sure, you know. Somebody who believes in the sovereignty of God, yes. Well, I said, my definition of Calvinist is somebody who has learned to trust in the sovereign goodness of God. That's, in my reckoning, a Calvinist. Somebody who has learned to trust in the sovereign goodness of God. And every word in that definition or explanation matters. The learning and the trusting in the sovereign goodness of God. It's all there together. And we see Joshua trusting in the sovereign goodness of God here. And so in verse 10 we read, the Lord threw these 5 kings and their armies into a panic before Israel. Now, quite clearly, God can and does control and influence the minds of men and women. He did so here. He put panic and he put fear into their hearts in order that he could facilitate Israel's victory over them. So God controls and influences the decisions of men who are not Christians. Verse 11 is a stunning verse, isn't it? And they fled before Israel on the road from Beth Horon, and the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them. Wow. I can remember being on holiday and visiting some missionaries in Bavaria in southern Germany, and there was on the weather forecast due a hailstorm, a very localized hailstorm because it's a very mountainous area there, and we had to be careful that we were not out in it, and we were told to make sure that we did not leave our car out in it. So the storm came, very localized. We made sure the car was under cover. But when we went out after the storm had passed, people who had not put their cars under cover, you could see the dents in the roof that these hailstones, which some of them were still there because they were frozen water, were about the size of a cricket ball, and that they had made in the car. Well, God uses hail. So this was no ordinary run-of-the-mill hailstorm. This was a natural phenomena, yes. It was more than that. It was a miracle. A big godder doesn't have problems with God behaving in this way. Now notice the verse says there that the Lord is singled out as being responsible for this hailstorm. It was the Lord hurled large stones down on them, verse 11. The Lord did it. Okay, secondly, only the enemies of Israel suffered because of the hail. This hailstorm was restricted to an area where the Canaanite kings and their armies were located. Thirdly, the hail was huge. It was large enough to kill more of the enemy than fell under the swords of the Israelite soldiers. Next point, a hailstone during midsummer would have been a rarity in that part of the world. The history books tell us, or the books on weather in Palestine and that area tell us that there are only between 5 to 8 days of hail per year in the coastal plain. Now, if you've heard me preach before, you will know that the geographical formation of Israel there and the fact of its coastal plain on one side and the desert on the other is responsible for the type of climate it has, and how God often used the climate to discipline his people. So it's very important that the geographical state of the land had such an influence on the weather there. But only 5 to 8 days of hail per year on that coastal plain, and that only took place in midwinter, and here we are in midsummer. Now let me give you sort of 4 things, rather like bullet points, about the sovereignty of God and nature. Because this is a big talking point today, isn't it? How much is God in control of nature? The hurricanes that we have, the earthquakes, the natural disasters that take place. How much is God responsible for those things? 4 things. 1, God is absolutely sovereign over all of nature. He can send devastation, and he may permit Satan to work havoc on the earth. 2, God is in absolute control over all the so-called forces of nature. And this is evident from many, many, many biblical texts, but I won't give you a whole list of verses. God's in control of what we call the forces of nature. Thirdly, God's sovereignty also extends to the life and the death of those who are caught up in those forces of nature when they exert themselves. Remember that verse in Deuteronomy 32 where God says, I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. There is no God beside me. God is saying that's what I do. And there's no one else beside me who does that. And number 4, God is sovereign, not Satan. Satan is not ultimately sovereign. He can do nothing apart from God's sovereign permission. And when you think about those 4 statements about God's sovereignty, I want to say, as Paul does in Romans, oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable are his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been in his counselor? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. And there comes a point in our experience and in our relationship with God where we confess that to God, and we confess it in an attitude and with a heart of worship. That God is way beyond what I can understand. Way beyond what I can work out. And as to whether I judge him as to whether he's done right or not, God says, I am the one who has the authority. I kill and I make alive. And then we come lastly to the one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible, in verse 12. And this is this speaking to the sun and the moon and telling it to stop. Now, the question that we have to answer is a very simple one here. Who is it who spoke here in the presence of Israel? Was it Joshua or was it God? Did Joshua speak to the sun and the moon? Or did he pray to God, who in turn spoke to the sun and the moon? You got it here? Did Joshua just tell the sun and moon to stand still? Or did Joshua speak to God, and God in turn told the sun and the moon to be still? And when you look at the Hebrew here, and you have to believe me on this, particularly when you look at the grammar of the Hebrew in the text here, either of those translations is possible. Okay? So we can't be absolutely categorical whether it was Joshua or whether it was God who spoke here. That the text, the actual words of the text, allow for either interpretation. So ultimately there is no way of really knowing. So we go on to the next question. What actually happened? Now, without getting you bogged down in too much detail, I want to give you 3 possible interpretations of what happened here. And I tell you the one that I go for. Okay? Now, you don't have to go for that one if you're more persuaded by the other 2. Number 1, a number of evangelical scholars believe that this is all figurative language. The whole of this little bit here in this chapter is figurative language. Now, these are Bible-believing evangelical scholars. That there wasn't a literal or physical alteration in the light of the sun or the moon. Rather, this was figurative language, often found in the Old Testament, that portrays the totality of God's victory over the Canaanites and how awesome God appeared that day when he was fighting on behalf of his people. And so the words directed to the sun and the moon describe in poetic terms Israel's victory in battle. And they say nothing about any miraculous repositioning or change of movement in the moon or the sun. Now, these people who take that view that this is just poetic language being used here do believe that God performs miracles. They simply do not see that happening here in Joshua 10. What they believe happening here, you can find evidence of in the Old Testament, where the sun and moon, and particularly in the Psalms, are personified and are described as if they were people standing still in awe and amazement at the power of God. Okay, I think you've got the idea here, the notion here. Now, I'm not convinced by that. I think there is a certain degree of weight because the Bible does speak about those things and personifies them, just as you know, that wisdom in the book of Proverbs is personified to a young man as a really attractive girl he ought to go out with. You know? And so the writer to the Proverbs says, wisdom to his son, this is the type of woman you need to marry. And he gives all the characteristics of wisdom. But he personifies wisdom as a very attractive and agreeable young lady who he should date. I don't think that's going on here. A more popular view of that, and the one that I think many of you would have heard here, is that God miraculously extended the light of the day in order to give Joshua more time to defeat the Canaanites. In other words, the battle had gone on throughout the day, and Joshua didn't want the onset of nighttime to give his enemies the chance to regroup and recover. So he needed more hours of daylight so he could continue defeating his enemies. So he prayed that the sun would not set in the west, but stop, and its light would enable Israel to finish off the Canaanites. Now, a little aside here, the Bible is not arguing in any shape or form at this point that the sun literally moves or rotates around the earth. Biblical writers simply did in their day what you and I do in our day. We describe events as they appear, not necessarily as they are. Okay, we say the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west and it makes a journey across the sky. Well, it doesn't do anything of the sort. But to you and me, it appears that it's doing that. And so we say, well, it's sunset at 8:13 this evening, and the sun will rise at 7:42 tomorrow morning. You and I know exactly what we mean by that. It appears that the sun has set and it has risen, 12 hours or more later. But it actually hasn't happened that way. Now, that's not an error in the Bible. Now, is this second view correct? How did God do it? Well, many folks say God miraculously stopped and slowed down the rotation of the earth. Now, you can go to a verse like Colossians 1:16 and 17 for evidence that God is capable of doing that sort of thing if he wanted to. But I am not persuaded that that is what actually happened. And two reasons why. Number one, it seems unlikely to me that God would have performed a global ministry involving the entire earth merely to extend light for a brief period in the area of Gibeon. That's a big ask, I think. Number two, this isn't the only time a miracle of this sort is recorded in the Bible. Now, where is the other one that helps us understand this one? Similar sort of thing. Where is it in the Bible? Yeah, you haven't been reading 2 Kings chapter 20 very recently. But remember Hezekiah. King Hezekiah fell sick, and God told him by the prophet Isaiah that he was going to die. And so he prays, gets really uptight about this, doesn't want to die. And so he prays to God that God will extend his life. God hears the prayer of King Hezekiah and says, yes, I'll give you an additional 15 years of life. And God gave that to Hezekiah. Very interesting to find what happened to Hezekiah during those 15 years. A very important lesson there, but we won't go into that now. Hezekiah then says to God, God, how do I know you're going to do this? Can you give me a sign that this will happen, that I will get an extra 15 years of his life. And Isaiah, who is just walking through the courtyard palaces, having left the king, suddenly gets a word from God, has to go back to the king and says, yes, 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 the sign that God gives you is this, that the shadow will go back 10 steps. Now, here scholars believe that Isaiah is referring to something that you and I would know and call a sundial, which consisted of a series of steps across which the shadow cast by the sun would move. You can imagine something like that happening. And the sign was that the shadow would reverse itself 10 steps, which would be the equivalent of about 5 hours. The point being that the sun appeared to move eastward instead of westward across the sky. Have you got it? The sun's going from the east to west. Okay? If it moves back 10 steps, it's going the other way to extend further a period of light. Now, if this were a global miracle, which I don't think it was, it means God not only stopped the rotation of the earth here in Joshua 10, but he actually reversed it. So it had to go back. Okay, so these are big issues, aren't they? You see, they're not easily resolved, some of these things, and you have to do a lot of thinking about it. A lot of thinking about it. Now, there is a fascinating, well, I find it fascinating, little comment on this in 2 Chronicles 32 and verse 31, which says that ambassadors from Babylon on one occasion traveled to Palestine to gain information about what? To gain information about the sign that had been done in the land. Wow, isn't that interesting, that little bit? You know, you would read a verse like that sometimes. So what on earth was all that about? A sign done in the land. But that sign done in the land, if you look at the context in Chronicles, is referring to Hezekiah. Now, I'm going to burst a bubble for some of you, I feel sure. Because a good number of you may have heard stories or reported stories that scientists at NASA, in their space flight calculations, have identified a missing day in astronomical history. And that day can be accounted for by what happened to Joshua and to Hezekiah. Now, have any of you heard that view? Yes, you have. A number of you have. Now, I'm really sorry to burst a bubble like that because it does seem a nice thing to believe, doesn't it? But there is no confirmation whatsoever from any reputable astronomers that that actually happened. Now, the most likely explanation of what happened, and the one that I opt for, and listen carefully now, isn't that Joshua prayed that sunlight be extended at the end of the day, but that he prayed that darkness be extended at the beginning of the day. Now, you've got to read the text extremely carefully here. I say it's not a question of sunlight being extended at the end of the day, but it was a matter that he prayed that darkness would be extended. Darkness, not sunlight, but darkness would be extended at the beginning of the day. That is to say, early in the morning hours. Now, several things I think are worth noting on this. One, the Hebrew verb translated in verse 12, stand still, literally means to be dumb or to be silent or to be still. Now, this could easily refer to the sun and the moon ceasing to shine their light. That's very important. It could mean that they were ceasing to shine their light, rather than any cessation of apparent movement. Because I don't think there was any movement of the heavenly bodies going on at this particular point. God did something miraculous, but it was different from that. And the same is true again in verse 13, where the word translated stopped could mean that the radiance of light from the sun and the moon ceased to shine on that part of the globe at that moment, but it was shining elsewhere. Point number 2, according to verse 9, Joshua and his armies, remember this, had been marching all night, which implies, to my understanding, that he attacked as a surprise strategy while it was still dark. And so he wasn't asking for more sunlight, he was asking for more hours of darkness, that somehow he could get on with his surprise attack and defeat them that way. So if God prolonged the darkness, it would aid the surprise attack that Joshua was about to launch. Okay, come down to verse 12 again. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ai Halon. Now this valley is about 10 miles west of Gibeon. And this suggests that the sun was to the east over Gibeon, and therefore the moon was to the west over Ai Halon, which would mean that the time of day would be early morning. Now, if this is true, what I've just said to you, then it argues against the idea of what happened was a prolonging of sunlight at the end of the day, and it argues for the idea that it was a prolonging of darkness at the beginning of the day. Now, what about verse 13b? And so the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the nations avenged itself on its enemies. The sun stopped in the middle of the day and delayed going down about a full day, or as on an ordinary day, as some translations have it. If the sun was not visible because God somehow miraculously blotted its light, I think this text in verse 13b would simply be describing the situation in terms of just how it appeared to those who were on the earth. And since the sun was blacked out, one could not see it run its course across the sky from east to west. You couldn't witness it. There was something blotting out the light of the sun. The sun was still going from east to west, but you weren't able to see it. You know, the ordinary day, the sun went from the east to the west. Now, I'm definitely inclined to think that this is the best interpretation and explanation. That God somehow prevented the sun from normally shining as it does at the beginning of every day if you live in that part of the world. You get the sun shining every day. Now, of course, the question is, how did God do it? How did God do it? Did God cause a cloud cover resulting from the hailstorm to prevent the shining of the sun? I think it's something like that must have happened. And I tell you another biblical warrant for it in a minute. I think if I was you, I would then be asking, what about a solar eclipse? You know, what about a solar eclipse? A major problem with solar eclipses and their interpretation is that astronomers know precisely when solar eclipses occurred in central Palestine between the years 1500 and 1000 BC. And none of the dates fits the time which we know that Joshua lived. Now, I won't go into the details as to how they know the dates of the solar eclipses so many years BC. But I can tell you that bit of information is absolutely vital when you come to establishing the day in the New Testament that Jesus died. You know, because quite clearly we think he died on Good Friday, and he rose again on early Sunday morning, and you think, 3 days? 3 days? I don't get 3 days out of that. And of course you don't get 3 days out of it. So it's like clearly Jesus didn't die on Friday. So you've got to read the text carefully, and you've got to see, there's a special Passover, and that means that was an extra Passover day. They were celebrating an extra Passover. Why were they celebrating an extra Passover? How did they know? There's an eclipse. Can you go back to the eclipse at that time? Yes, you can. So the likelihood, I take it, and I would suddenly take it a little bit further than I saw some other people, I could well believe that Jesus died late on Wednesday. Now remember, you know, we do our day differently from the Jewish day. 6 o'clock in the evening is the beginning and end of the Jewish day, okay? So, but don't hold me to ransom on that one. Let's come back to there. So I don't believe it was solar eclipse. I think, do you remember what happened in Egypt at the time of the Exodus? Let me read Exodus 20:21 to you. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand towards the sky so that darkness spreads over Egypt, darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand towards the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the place where they lived. Wow. I think that's what God did here in Joshua 20. The same as he did in Exodus. And he caused this darkness. The sun still continued moving from east to west across the sky, but nobody could witness that happening because there was this cloud over it. But the most amazing thing, and I close with this morning, the most amazing thing in this story isn't that God performed a miracle of nature to help Israel defeat the Canaanites. The most amazing miracle of all is what comes out in verse 14, is that God listened to a human being. Or the words that another translation has it, God heeded the voice of a man. God heeded the voice of a man. What's amazing isn't that God hears and responds to our prayers, because we have hundreds of personal illustrations and examples of that happening in our own lives, as we can read of in the Bible as well. What makes this verse here, verse 14, so stunning and unprecedented at this time in God's revelation is that God listened to Joshua and intervened in the routine operation of nature to provide victory for his people. Can I put it to you like this? It was as if God said to Joshua, I'm going to put myself under the command of a man. Now this is the sovereign God I talked to you about earlier. Says, I'm going to put myself under the command of a man. I am in no man's debt to do this. I don't owe anything to Joshua or to anybody else for that matter. I am free and sovereign as God to do as I please. But in this case, God says, what pleases me most is to do what Joshua asks me to do. That's stunning, isn't it? That God says, what pleases me at this very moment, it's not that I'm the God who answers prayer or doesn't answer prayer, because we know he does that. Is that I will do what is buzzing around in Joshua's mind at that point, and whatever he asks for, I will do it. You know, these are big miracles here, aren't they? And yet none of them are remarkable to a big God, are they? And if you are a big God and you believe in a big God, then they are not remarkable. And if you know that God is great and immeasurable and majestic, then these stories are just fringes of his power. They are mere droplets in an ocean of divine omnipotence, just droplets in the ocean of the power which is our God. And then Paul says, if this God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? And if God has made the greatest, indeed the most inconceivable sacrifice possible for you and me in giving us his son to die on a cross, to atone for our sins and our failures, and big as our failures have been, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? There is an unspeakable, unshakable, glorious logic to the way that heaven thinks. There really is. But somehow heaven's logic in these things makes no sense to you and me, and so we end up praying boring prayers. That's what happens. Our prayers are boring because we don't accept the logic of heaven. So I urge you, as I urge myself, to start asking for outrageous answers to prayer. Answers that seem utterly impossible to you, but not impossible to God. And if God can do exceedingly abundantly beyond every single thing your mind can ever conceive or your tongue can ever articulate, what reason do you have for keeping your prayers timid and tiny? There is no reason. And the logic of heaven goes against our thinking sometimes. So make your prayers every bit as big and as bold as your God is. That's the standard of our praying. As big and as bold as God is. And God says to you and me this morning, come and ask. And you don't have because you don't ask. Amen.
Yeah, get your historical calendars out, and in the run up to Easter, you want to get that sorted out. Maybe we'll ask Pastor John to share more about that in around Easter time, about the Easter dates. Let's pray. Oh, how great is our God. How great are you, God. How great, how big, how wide, how high, how deep are you, God, and your love for us. Oh, that we might be like your servants in the Bible who believed in a great big God. We've sung about it today. We've listened about it. We've thought about it. We've sung it from our lungs physically. We've meditated on it in our souls, in our spirits, on how great you are. Now may we walk out and encounter our lives with that truth. Even the word truth, it's something set in stone, but it can get bigger. Our understanding of that truth can unfold. The revelation of that truth of how big you are can increase. And so we ask that it would, God, in these days, even as we chew on it, even as we consider it, how big you are and how much you are pleased to answer the prayers of those who have faith in a great big God. The more we have faith in God, the more he delights to respond to that faith. So God, we all have miracles that we are seeking for. I know that each one of us in this place has miracles. Some have forgotten some things that you had been praying and you'd put them in a box. It's time to get these things out again. It's time to start believing in the miracles again. Remember, this is
on the 27th of April 2018 here in Glasgow. And this event is 2 days of straight teaching and training and activation from the prophetic ministry team here at Glasgow Prophetic Centre. So you're going to have myself, you're going to have Sarah Jane Biggert, head of all things seer and intercession and business, and Emma Stark, the lead prophet here, as well as Pastor John Hansford. And Sarah Jane's going to be helping us unlock our spiritual senses, see more in the spirit. Pastor John is going to be bringing some theological teaching, some life lessons to help us prophesy better. I'm going to be bringing some teaching on the discerning of spirits, a little bit of teaching on prophetic culture and how prophecy can transform a nation. And Emma is going to be teaching on the art of prophecy and taking you through a journey from the basic level to the deeper levels of the prophetic. So if you're eager to grow in prophecy, if you would love to find out how you hear from God, if you would just love to gather with other people who are hungry for the prophetic, who are hungry for the supernatural, then this event is for you. You can find out more information on our website. It's the 2-day prophetic intensive, the 26th and the 27th of April 2018. Hi friend, you are so welcome to the live stream of our Sunday morning gathering here at Christian International Glasgow Church. You're part of our forever family, and we count it a privilege that you're tuning in and that you're joining us here with where we are in Glasgow in Scotland. Wherever you are, we pray that you encounter God, that you're encouraged by the teaching, that you're strengthened by any prophetic words that are given, but most of all, that you feel the presence of God where you are. We'll probably be worshiping just now, so I invite you, put in your headphones, listen to some worship music, and join in with some worship while you wait. In a moment, we're going to take our offering, which is an exciting part of the life here at Christian International Glasgow. So if you would really like to support the work in this ministry, and you would like to enable us to be able to put out more videos and more teaching, then you can click on the link as part of this post, follow the instructions where you can give either monthly or one-off as you feel led. So we just pray that you would feel blessed, that you would be encouraged, that you would be strengthened, that you would laugh, that you would enjoy yourself, but that you would meet God as you watch what God is going to do here, and that you would feel a part of the family as well. Thank you for tuning in to the live stream of our Sunday morning family gathering. This gathering is only a small percentage of the things that go on in this building. We have a great meeting space here where there's lots of training events, lots of deliverance days, and I want to extend an invitation to 2 particular events that are coming up in the next short